You know, they say blood is thicker than water, but sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who cut you the deepest. My name is Carolyn Evans, and at 72 years old, I thought I had learned all there was to know about human nature. I was wrong. What I'm about to share with you happened just 6 months ago, and it changed everything I believed about family, loyalty, and my own worth. For 3 years, I had been living under my son's roof, paying $800 every month for the family's health insurance policy. $800 that came straight from my Social Security and the small pension my late husband Robert left me. I thought I was contributing to a loving household. I thought I was wanted. I thought wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But here's the thing about being underestimated, especially as an older woman. People think we're fragile, that we'll just accept whatever treatment comes our way. They forget that we've lived through decades of life's curveballs, that we've buried husbands, raised children, and survived things that would break younger spirits. They forget that beneath our gray hair and wrinkled hands lies a strength forged by experience. What happened when I overheard those words? When my daughter-in-law called me a medical burden, set in motion a chain of events that none of them saw coming. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one planning the biggest surprise. My story begins 3 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday in October. I remember it clearly because it was the day I buried my independence along with my pride, though I didn't realize it at the time. Robert had been gone for 8 months, and the house we had shared for 37 years felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that echoed off empty walls. That's when my son David called. Sweet David, my firstborn, with his father's gentle eyes and my stubborn chin. He had always been the responsible one, the child who called every Sunday and remembered my birthday without Facebook reminders. When he suggested I move in with him and his wife Jessica, it felt like a lifeline, thrown to a drowning woman. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone in that big house," he had said, his voice warm with concern through the phone. "Jessica and I have been talking, and we want you to come live with us. We have that spare bedroom that's just sitting empty, and honestly, we'd love the company." I had hesitated. At 69, I wasn't ready to surrender my independence entirely. But the silence in my house had grown so loud it was deafening, and the thought of family dinners and grandchildren's laughter filling the spaces between my days seemed like a gift from heaven. Jessica had been nothing but welcoming during those first few months. She was 28 then, a petite brunette with an infectious laugh and a way of making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a local tech company, and she had this energy about her that made our house feel alive again. "Carolyn, I'm so glad you're here," she would say, and her smile seemed genuine. "David talks about you constantly, and now I get to see why." She would bring me tea in the evenings, ask about my day, and even suggested we start a small garden together in the backyard. I felt useful again, needed. When they mentioned struggling with their health insurance premiums, it seemed natural to offer to help. After all, I was living in their home, eating their food, sharing their utilities. $800 a month. Felt like a fair contribution, especially when it meant my son and his wife could breathe a little easier financially. "Are you sure, Mom?" David had asked, his brow furrowed with that same concerned expression he'd worn as a child when he worried about taking too many cookies from the jar. "That's a lot of money." But I insisted. Robert's pension was modest but steady, and my Social Security covered my basic needs. I wanted to contribute something meaningful to the household, something that would make me feel less like a charity case and more like a valued family member. For the first year, everything seemed perfect. Jessica would drive me to my doctor's appointments, chatting pleasantly about her work or asking about my childhood stories. We would cook together sometimes, and she seemed genuinely interested in learning my mother's recipe for apple pie and my grandmother's secret to perfect cornbread. David would come home from his job at the engineering firm with stories about his day, and we would sit around the dinner table like a real family. Jessica would laugh at his jokes, ask about my book club meetings, and share amusing anecdotes from her office. Those evenings felt warm and golden, like something out of a magazine about multi-generational living. I should have seen the cracks forming, but love has a way of making us blind to uncomfortable truths. The first sign was subtle. Jessica's responses to my questions became shorter, more clipped. When I asked about her day, she would give me one-word answers while scrolling through her phone. When I offered to help with household chores, she would wave me away with barely concealed impatience. "I've got it handled, Carolyn," she would say, not looking up from whatever was consuming her attention on that glowing screen. The warmth in her voice began to fade like a photograph left too long in sunlight. Where once she had seemed genuinely interested in my stories about the past, now her eyes would glaze over when I spoke. She would make subtle little comments about how I was always underfoot, or how I used too much hot water during my showers. But the most painful change was how she began to treat my health issues. At 72, I wasn't falling apart, but I wasn't 25 either. I had arthritis in my hands that made opening jars difficult. My blood pressure required daily medication and regular monitoring. I had developed a heart murmur that necessitated quarterly checkups with a cardiologist. None of these conditions were life-threatening or dramatically limiting, but they required attention and occasional appointments. In the beginning, Jessica had been understanding, even helpful. She would remind me to take my pills and offer to pick up my prescriptions when she was running errands. But as the months passed, each doctor's appointment became a source of visible frustration for her. She would sigh heavily when I mentioned needing a ride to see Dr. Morrison about my blood pressure. She would tap her fingers impatiently on the steering wheel during the drive, making pointed comments about how she was missing work or had to rearrange her schedule. "Another appointment?" she would ask, her voice carrying a tone that made me feel like I was being unreasonable for needing medical care. "Didn't you just see him last month?" I began to notice how she would roll her eyes when I moved slowly getting in and out of the car, or how she would check her phone constantly in the waiting room, sighing with each passing minute as if my medical needs were personally inconveniencing her. The woman who had once brought me evening tea now barely acknowledged my presence in the morning. She would grab her coffee and rush out the door for work without so much as a goodbye, leaving me feeling invisible in what was supposed to be my home. David seemed oblivious to the change, which perhaps hurt more than Jessica's growing coldness. When I tried to bring up my concerns with him, he would dismiss them with gentle explanations about how stressed Jessica was at work, how the marketing industry was demanding, how she was probably just going through a difficult time. "She's got a lot on her plate right now, Mom," he would say, patting my hand in that patronizing way that made me feel like a child complaining about imaginary monsters under the bed. "You know how it is with younger people and their careers. Give her some space, and I'm sure things will get back to normal." But things didn't get back to normal. They got worse. Jessica began making comments about my presence in the house that felt deliberately hurtful. She would mention how much quieter it had been before I moved in, or how much easier it was to keep the house clean when it was just the two of them. She would talk about friends who had their houses to themselves, making pointed comparisons that left me feeling like an unwelcome guest who had overstayed their welcome. The worst part was how she began to treat my belongings. The few pieces of furniture I had brought from my old house, the photographs of Robert and me that I had placed on the dresser in my room, even my books, all seemed to be constant sources of irritation for her. "Do you really need all these old books taking up space?" she would ask, gesturing dismissively at the small shelf where I kept my favorite novels and the poetry collection Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I began to feel like I was shrinking, becoming smaller and more insignificant with each passing day. The confident woman who had raised 3 children, managed a household budget through lean years, and stood by her husband's side through his long illness, was slowly disappearing. In her place was someone apologetic, careful, walking on eggshells in what was supposed to be her sanctuary. My other children, Michael and Sarah, lived across the country. Michael was stationed in California with the Air Force, and Sarah had moved to Oregon for her husband's job. Our phone calls were weekly, but brief, filled with the surface-level updates that families share across great distances. They knew I was living with David and Jessica, and they seemed relieved that I wasn't alone. I didn't have the heart to tell them how alone I actually felt. The monthly insurance payments continued like clockwork, $800 transferred from my account to cover the family policy that included David, Jessica, and now me. It was a significant chunk of my fixed income, but I had committed to it, and I kept my word. The payments were automatic, deducted on the 15th of each month, and seeing that expense on my bank statement had become a reminder of my worth to this household. At least, that's what I told myself. I was contributing something valuable, something necessary. Without my contribution, they would struggle to afford the comprehensive coverage we all needed. David had a pre-existing condition from a childhood injury that made individual insurance prohibitively expensive. My financial contribution wasn't just helpful, it was essential. But as Jessica's treatment of me continued to deteriorate, I began to wonder if even this significant contribution was enough to earn basic respect and kindness in what was supposed to be my home. The breaking point was building slowly, like pressure in a steam kettle. I would lie in my bed at night, listening to Jessica and David's muffled conversations through the thin walls, catching fragments about their social plans, their work frustrations, their dreams for the future. I was never mentioned in these conversations, as if I were a piece of furniture rather than a family member. During the day, I would find myself retreating more and more to my room, trying to stay out of Jessica's way, trying to minimize my presence in the house I was helping to maintain. I would eat my meals quickly and quietly, clean up after myself meticulously, and speak only when spoken to. The vibrant woman who had once hosted dinner parties and led book club discussions was learning to make herself invisible. I was becoming a ghost in my own life, and the saddest part was how gradually it had happened. Like a frog in slowly boiling water, I had adjusted to each degree of temperature change until I found myself in a situation that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. But life has a way of forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths, and mine was about to arrive in the form of an overheard conversation that would shatter the fragile peace I had been desperately trying to maintain. The house had settled into its evening rhythm. David was in his home office catching up on work emails, the soft clicking of his keyboard providing a steady soundtrack to the quiet house. I was in the living room, working on a crossword puzzle, and half watching a cooking show on the television with the volume turned low. It was one of those peaceful moments that had become increasingly rare, when the tension in the house seemed to ebb, and I could almost pretend things were the way they used to be. Jessica was in the kitchen, and I could hear her moving around, putting away dishes from dinner. Then her phone rang, and I heard her answer with a brightness in her voice that I hadn't heard directed at me in months. "Hey, Melissa. Oh my God. Yes, I'm so glad you called." I didn't intend to eavesdrop. The house was small, and sound traveled easily between rooms. I was simply existing in the shared space of our home, doing what I did every evening, when Jessica's conversation began to drift into the living room. At first, it was typical friend chatter. Work complaints, weekend plans, mutual acquaintances, relationship drama. I continued working on my puzzle, only half listening to the familiar cadence of female friendship that reminded me of my own phone calls with my longtime friends back home. But then I heard my name, and everything changed. "Oh, don't get me started on Carolyn," Jessica said, and the disdain in her voice was like a physical blow. "I swear, Melissa, Living with her is like having a medical burden that never goes away. My pencil stopped moving across the puzzle. The cooking show continued playing on the television, but the sound seemed to fade into background noise as Jessica's words hit me with the force of a slap. Medical burden. That's what I was to her. Not a family member. Not someone who was contributing $800 a month to keep their health insurance active. Not David's mother or a woman with 72 years of life experience and wisdom to share. A medical burden. She's always got some appointment or some pill she needs or some complaint about how she's feeling, Jessica continued, her voice carrying the exasperated tone of someone discussing a particularly troublesome pet. And David just enables it. He thinks I should be more understanding, but honestly, I didn't sign up to be a caregiver when I married him. My hands began to shake, and the crossword puzzle blurred as tears gathered in my eyes. But I couldn't stop listening. It was like watching a car accident happen in slow motion. I was horrified, but I couldn't look away. The worst part is how she's always just there, you know? Like, I can't have a moment's peace in my own house. She's in the kitchen when I'm trying to cook. She's in the living room when I want to watch TV. She's always asking questions or wanting to chat. I feel like I can't breathe sometimes. My own house. Those words cut particularly deep because I had been paying for the privilege of being unwelcome in her house. $800. A month for the right to be treated like an intrusion. I keep telling myself it's temporary, Jessica went on, and I could hear her moving around the kitchen as she talked, probably pacing as she often did during phone calls. But honestly, Melissa, I don't know how much more of this I can take. I'm 28 years old. I should be able to come home to peace and quiet, not have to deal with someone else's medical issues and emotional needs all the time. There was a pause, and I could hear Melissa's voice faintly through the phone, though I couldn't make out her words. Whatever she said made Jessica laugh, but it was a bitter sound, lacking any warmth or humor. Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. And the thing is, she's not even that sick, you know? It's all these little things that she makes into big dramas. Oh, my arthritis hurts today. Oh, I need to see the cardiologist again. Oh, can you pick up my prescription? It's like she expects me to revolve my whole life around her medical needs. Each word was like a needle piercing my heart. The arthritis that made it difficult for me to open jars or button my sweaters wasn't a drama I was creating for attention. The heart murmur that required monitoring wasn't a performance designed to inconvenience Jessica. These were real medical conditions that came with aging, conditions that millions of older adults managed every day while still maintaining their dignity and independence. But in Jessica's narrative, I was a hypochondriac seeking attention, a burden who was deliberately making her life difficult. And don't even get me started on how she monopolizes David's time, Jessica continued. Every weekend it's something. She needs help with this. She wants to talk about that. She has some story about the past that she just has to share. I feel like I'm competing with his mother for my own husband's attention. That accusation stung particularly sharply because it was so unfair. I had been careful not to interfere in their marriage, had gone out of my way to give them space and privacy. The conversations Jessica was complaining about were usually initiated by David, who would ask about my day or my health because he cared about my well-being. I had never demanded his attention or tried to come between them. The money she contributes helps. I'll give her that, Jessica said, and I held my breath, hoping that perhaps she would acknowledge the significance of my financial contribution to their household. But honestly, at this point, I'd rather struggle with the insurance payments than have to deal with all the rest of it. At least if it was just David and me, we could actually enjoy our home. And there it was. Even my financial contribution, substantial as it was, wasn't enough to earn basics, respect or kindness. The $800 I faithfully transferred every month was just barely enough to make my presence tolerable, and even that was becoming insufficient. I keep hoping she'll decide to move to one of those senior living places, Jessica said, and I could hear the wistfulness in her voice. You know, somewhere with activities and other people her age. But she seems pretty settled here, and David would never ask her to leave. He's too nice for his own good sometimes. The conversation continued, but I had heard enough. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to set down my pencil. I sat in that living room, surrounded by the familiar objects of a home that had never truly been mine, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. For 3 years, I had been making myself smaller, quieter, more apologetic, trying to earn my place in this family. I had been grateful for their tolerance, thankful for their charity, accepting of their conditions. I had allowed myself to believe that I was lucky to be here, that I should be thankful for whatever crumbs of affection came my way. But sitting there, absorbing the full impact of Jessica's words, I realized that I had been looking at everything backwards. I wasn't the lucky recipient of their generosity. I was a paying tenant who was being treated like an unwelcome guest. I was a contributing member of the household who was being made to feel like a burden. More than that, I was a woman with decades of life experience, wisdom earned through joy and sorrow, strength forged by surviving the loss of the love of my life. I was someone who had raised 3 successful children, managed a household through good times and lean times, and maintained my dignity through challenges that would have broken lesser spirits. I was not a medical burden. I was Carolyn Evans, and it was time to remember who that woman was. The conversation in the kitchen was winding down, Jessica making plans to meet Melissa for lunch over the weekend, complaining about having to coordinate with David's work schedule and my potential medical appointments. Even their social plans, it seemed, were complicated by my existence in their lives. When Jessica finally ended the call, I sat in the living room for a long time, staring at the crossword puzzle I would never finish. The cooking show had ended, replaced by the evening news, but I didn't change the channel. I just sat there, processing what I had heard, feeling the weight of revelation settle around me like a heavy blanket. David came out of his office eventually, stretching and yawning after his long day. He looked tired but content, the way he always did after a productive evening of work. He glanced into the living room and smiled when he saw me. "How was your evening, Mom?" he asked, his voice warm with genuine affection. "Find anything good on TV?" I looked at my son, this man I had raised, this person who loved me but was blind to how I was being treated in his own home. For a moment, I considered telling him what I had overheard, laying out the full scope of Jessica's resentment and cruelty. But I didn't. Something held me back, some instinct that told me this wasn't the right time or the right approach. David was a good man, but he was also a husband who wanted to believe the best about his wife. He was caught in the middle of a situation he probably didn't fully understand, and dropping this bombshell on him wouldn't solve anything. No, this situation called for a different approach. It called for the kind of careful planning and strategic thinking that had gotten me through decades of life's challenges. "It was fine, dear," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my heart. "I think I'm going to head to bed now. It's been a long day." David kissed my forehead, the same gesture he had made as a child when he wanted to comfort me after a difficult day. "Sleep well, Mom. Love you." "Love you too, sweetheart." I went to my room and closed the door, but I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat at the small desk where I kept my financial records and began to think. I thought about dignity and self-respect. I thought about the $800 that automatically transferred from my account every month. I thought about the woman I had been before I moved into this house, and the woman Jessica's cruelty was slowly erasing. Most of all, I thought about power. The power I had given away so gradually I hadn't even noticed it was gone. The power that came with financial independence, with having options, with refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. As I sat there, in the quiet darkness of my room, I began to formulate a plan. It wouldn't be dramatic or confrontational. It wouldn't involve tears or accusations or demands for apologies. It would be quiet and methodical and absolutely devastating in its simplicity. Jessica thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman, a medical burden who had nowhere else to go and no choice but to accept whatever treatment came her way. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching my mood perfectly. I woke before my alarm, having spent most of the night staring at the ceiling and refining the plan that had begun to take shape in my mind. By the time David and Jessica were stirring, I was already dressed and had coffee brewing in the kitchen. Jessica appeared first, rushing through her morning routine with the efficiency of someone running late. She grabbed a travel mug and filled it with coffee, barely acknowledging my presence as she gathered her things for work. "Morning, Carolyn," she said, her voice carrying the perfunctory politeness of someone going through the motions of civility. "Good morning, Jessica," I replied, my tone equally neutral. But inside, I was studying her with new eyes, seeing her differently now that I knew the truth about how she really felt about me. She was younger than I had remembered, her face unlined by the experiences that had carved wisdom into my own features. There was something almost childish about her impatience, her inability to see beyond her own immediate wants and needs. I found myself feeling almost sorry for her, this woman who was so limited in her capacity for empathy and understanding. David appeared a few minutes later, moving with the relaxed pace of someone who didn't have to be at the office until 9. He kissed Jessica goodbye, and she left with a distracted wave in my direction, already focused on whatever challenges awaited her at work. "You're up early this morning, Mom," David observed, settling at the kitchen table with his own cup of coffee and the newspaper. "Everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I said, and I realized that for the first time in months, that was almost true. Having a plan, having a sense of purpose and direction, had lifted a weight from my shoulders I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "I just have some things I need to take care of today." David nodded absently, already absorbed in the sports section. This was our typical morning routine, comfortable and familiar, and I felt a pang of sadness knowing that it would be ending soon. Not immediately, but soon. After David left for work, I had the house to myself, which was exactly what I needed. I went to my room and pulled out the folder where I kept all my important financial documents: insurance policies, bank statements, pension information, and most importantly, the contact information for the insurance company that handled our family policy. I had called them before, of course. When I first moved in with David and Jessica, I had been the one to add my name to the policy and set up the automatic payments. I knew the account number, the policy details, and most importantly, my rights as the person paying the premiums. The customer service representative who answered my call was pleasant and professional. I explained that I needed to make changes to the policy, and she pulled up my account without any difficulty. "I see that you're the policyholder and the one responsible for premium payments," she said. "What changes would you like to make, Mrs. Evans?" "I need to cancel the policy," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I'll be moving out of state and will need different coverage." There was a brief pause as she processed this request. "I understand. I do need to let you know that there will be a 30-day notice period before the cancellation takes effect. Your next payment will process as scheduled, and then coverage will end on the 15th of next month." Perfect. That gave me time to make other arrangements while ensuring that the family would have adequate notice of the change. I wasn't interested in leaving them without coverage immediately, despite how they had treated me. I just wanted them to understand the consequences of taking my contributions for granted. "That's fine," I said. "Please proceed with the cancellation." After I hung up, I sat at my desk for a few minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what I had just done. $800 a month would no longer be leaving my account. $800 that I could use for my own needs, my own future, my own plans. For the first time in 3 years, I felt a sense of financial freedom that was intoxicating. But the insurance cancellation was just the first step in a larger plan that was beginning to crystallize in my mind. I opened my laptop, a gift from Sarah for my 70th birthday, and began to research senior living communities. Not the depressing nursing homes that Jessica probably imagined when she wished I would leave, but active, independent living communities where people my age were thriving. The options were more varied and appealing than I had expected. There were communities with golf courses and swimming pools, places with book clubs and art classes, residences where people my age were starting new chapters of their lives rather than simply waiting for them to end. I bookmarked several that looked particularly interesting, noting their locations, amenities, and costs. Many of them were surprisingly affordable, especially when I factored in the $800 I would no longer be spending on health insurance for people who viewed me as a burden. As I researched, I found myself getting excited about possibilities I hadn't considered in years. I could have my own space again, my own kitchen, my own schedule. I could make friends with people who chose to spend time with me rather than people who tolerated my presence out of obligation. I could be Carolyn Evans again, instead of David's mother or Jessica's burden. The day passed quietly, productively. I made phone calls, requested brochures, and began to construct a timeline for my departure. I wasn't rushing into anything, but I was also not going to delay unnecessarily. Once I made a decision, I preferred to act on it decisively. When David and Jessica returned from work that evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, the same routine I had followed for 3 years. But everything felt different now. I was no longer the apologetic, diminished woman who had been slowly disappearing. I was someone with a plan, someone with options, someone who had remembered her own worth. "Something smells good," David said, loosening his tie as he entered the kitchen. "What are you making?" "Your favorite," I said, smiling at him with genuine warmth. "Pot roast with those little potatoes you like." Jessica appeared a few minutes later, looking tired and irritated from her day. She glanced at the stove and made a non-committal sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been annoyance. I couldn't tell, and I realized I no longer cared. We ate dinner together, the 3 of us around the same table where we had shared hundreds of meals. David chatted about his day, asking about mine in return. Jessica ate silently, scrolling through her phone and contributing only occasional grunts to the conversation. It was a perfectly ordinary evening, the kind we had shared so many times before. But I knew it was one of the last, and that knowledge gave it a bittersweet quality that made me appreciate David's presence, while simultaneously mourning the family dynamic I had hoped to have but never achieved. After dinner, I excused myself and went to my room, leaving David and Jessica to their evening routine. I could hear them talking in the living room, their voices too low for me to make out words. But the tone was relaxed and intimate in a way that reminded me of the conversations I had overheard between Robert and myself in the years before he died. I spent the evening reading, something I had always loved but had been doing less of lately. I had allowed Jessica's subtle criticisms about my books and my reading habits to make me self-conscious about this simple pleasure. Tonight, I read without apology, losing myself in a story about a woman who had reinvented her life after a major loss. The parallel wasn't lost on me. Over the next few days, I maintained my normal routine while quietly making preparations for the dramatic changes that were coming. I received brochures from 3 different senior living communities, each one offering a lifestyle that seemed more appealing than the walking on eggshells existence I had been living. I also began making subtle changes to my daily habits, small acts of rebellion that helped me reclaim my sense of self. I started playing music in the mornings while I had my coffee, something I had stopped doing because Jessica complained it was too early for noise. I resumed my practice of taking long baths in the evenings, something I had curtailed because of comments about using too much hot water. These were small things, but they felt significant. Each one was a tiny declaration of independence, a quiet assertion that I was still Carolyn Evans, still a woman with preferences and needs and the right to enjoy simple pleasures in what was supposed to be my home. Jessica didn't seem to notice these small changes, which somehow made them even more satisfying. She continued her pattern of subtle hostility and barely concealed impatience, unaware that I was no longer the vulnerable woman who would accept such treatment indefinitely. David, bless his heart, remained oblivious to the undercurrents in his own home. He continued to treat me with the same affection he always had, asking about my day, sharing stories from work, and maintaining the easy relationship we had always enjoyed. It made what was coming even more painful because I knew that my leaving would hurt him. But I also knew that staying in a situation where I was unwelcome and unappreciated would ultimately damage our relationship more than a clean break would. The 15th of the month approached with the inevitability of sunrise. I watched the calendar, counting down the days until the insurance payment that would not be made, until the moment when Jessica and David would discover the first consequence of taking my contributions for granted. I had no idea that the revelation would come even sooner than expected, in a way that would expose not just my decision, but the full extent of Jessica's cruelty. Sometimes the universe has its own sense of timing, and mine was about to prove that Jessica's carefully constructed facade was more fragile than anyone imagined. The 14th of March arrived with an unseasonable warmth that felt like a promise of spring. I had been awake since 5 in the morning, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. Today was the day before my insurance payment was due to process automatically, and it would be the first month in 3 years that $800 would remain in my account instead of disappearing into the void of Jessica's ungrateful expectations. I made my morning coffee with particular care, using the good china cup that Robert had given me for our 10th anniversary. It was a small act of defiance, using something precious instead of the everyday mugs Jessica preferred. The coffee tasted better somehow, richer and more satisfying when drunk from a vessel that held decades of memories. Jessica emerged from the bedroom later than usual, her hair still damp from the shower and her movements hurried. She had mentioned something about an important presentation at work, though she rarely shared details of her professional life with me anymore. I watched her rush through her morning routine, this woman who thought so little of me that she discussed my private medical needs with strangers. She grabbed her usual travel mug and filled it with coffee, barely glancing in my direction as she gathered her laptop bag and car keys. But something made her pause at the kitchen counter, and she turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You seem different lately," she said, her voice carrying a note of suspicion. That surprised me. Happier or something. The observation caught me off guard, mainly because it was accurate. Despite everything, or perhaps because of everything, I had been feeling lighter recently. Having a plan, having taken decisive action, had lifted a burden from my shoulders that I hadn't fully recognized was there. "I suppose I have been feeling better," I said carefully, taking another sip of my coffee. "Spring is coming, and that always improves my mood." Jessica's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. For a moment, I wondered if she suspected something, if some instinct was warning her that the comfortable status quo was about to shift dramatically. But then her phone buzzed with a text message, and her attention shifted immediately to the screen. Whatever momentary curiosity she had felt about my improved demeanor was forgotten in favor of whatever urgent communication required her immediate response. "I'll be late tonight," she said, already moving toward the door. "That new client wants to meet after hours, and I can't say no if I want to keep my position secure." "Of course," I replied. "I'll keep dinner warm for you." She was gone without another word, leaving behind only the faint scent of her expensive perfume and the familiar feeling of being an afterthought in someone else's life. But today, that feeling didn't sting the way it usually did. Today, it felt like freedom. David appeared an hour later, moving with his typical unhurried morning pace. He was one of those fortunate people who worked for a company that valued results over FaceTime, allowing him flexibility in his schedule that many of his peers envied. He settled at the kitchen table with the newspaper and his coffee, a ritual that reminded me of Robert's morning routine all those years ago. Jessica seemed stressed this morning, he observed, not looking up from the business section. This new client has her really wound up. I made a non-committal sound of agreement, not trusting myself to comment on Jessica's stress levels without revealing more of my feelings than was wise. Instead, I busied myself with cleaning the breakfast dishes, a task that had become automatic after 3 years of trying to minimize any inconvenience my presence might cause. "Mom, you don't have to do that," David said, finally looking up from his paper. "Jessica and I can handle the kitchen cleanup." "I don't mind," I said, which was true. Having tasks to perform made me feel useful, purposeful, even if the people I was helping didn't appreciate the effort. It gives me something to do with my morning. David folded his newspaper and studied me with the same concerned expression he had worn as a child when he sensed something was troubling me. He had always been perceptive that way, more attuned to emotional undercurrents than many men his age. "Are you happy here, Mom?" he asked suddenly, the question hanging in the air between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we wanted to cross. The directness of his inquiry caught me off guard. For a moment, I considered telling him everything. The overheard conversation, Jessica's cruel comments, the insurance cancellation I had already set in motion. I imagined the relief of finally sharing the burden of knowledge I had been carrying alone. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the genuine concern in his eyes, the love that had never wavered even when he failed to see what was happening in his own home. Perhaps it was the knowledge that forcing him to choose between his wife and his mother would cause him pain regardless of which choice he made. "I'm managing," I said finally, which wasn't exactly a lie. I was managing, just not in the way he probably assumed. David's frown deepened, and I could see him struggling with how to respond to such a carefully neutral answer. But before he could press further, his phone rang with a call from work, and the moment passed. He answered with his usual professional demeanor, already shifting into work mode even though he hadn't left the house yet. I finished the dishes and excused myself, leaving David to his conference call and his preparations for the day ahead. In my room, I pulled out the folder of senior living brochures that had arrived over the past few days. Each one painted a picture of a lifestyle that seemed increasingly appealing as I studied the photographs and read the descriptions. There was Sunset Manor, with its beautiful gardens and weekly cultural events. Residents were photographed laughing over book club discussions and learning watercolor techniques in bright art studios. The monthly fees were reasonable, especially when I factored in what I would save by not subsidizing David and Jessica's insurance. Heritage Hills offered a different appeal, with its focus on active living and community involvement. The brochure showed residents hiking local trails, volunteering at nearby schools, and participating in intergenerational programs that made them active contributors to the broader community rather than isolated elderly people marking time. But it was Maple Grove that captured my imagination most completely. The independent living community was built around the concept of lifelong learning, with partnerships with local colleges that allowed residents to audit classes, attend lectures, and participate in research projects. The idea of returning to academic pursuits after so many years away from formal education felt like opening a door to possibilities I had forgotten existed. I spent the morning researching each option more thoroughly, taking notes and comparing costs. By the time David left for work, I had narrowed my choices to 2 communities and had scheduled phone interviews with their admissions coordinators for the following week. The house felt different when I was alone in it now. Instead of the oppressive silence that had characterized so many of my days over the past months, it felt peaceful, almost expectant. I moved through the rooms with a lightness I hadn't experienced in years, no longer tiptoeing around someone else's moods or trying to make myself invisible. I decided to spend the afternoon in the garden, something I had been neglecting lately. due to Jessica's comments about the mess I made when I tracked soil into the house. But today, I didn't care about Jessica's opinions on dirt or anything else. I put on my oldest clothes and spent hours working in the flower beds that had been my pride and joy during my first year in this house. The physical labor felt therapeutic, connecting me to the earth and to memories of the garden Robert and I had tended together at our old house. My hands remembered the feel of rich soil, the satisfaction of pulling weeds and deadheading spent blooms. By late afternoon, the garden looked better than it had in months, and I felt renewed in a way that had nothing to do with the aching muscles that reminded me of my age. I was cleaning my gardening tools when I heard David's car in the driveway. He was home earlier than usual, and when he came through the back door and saw me in the garden, his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Mom, this looks incredible," he said, surveying the neat rows of emerging perennials and the freshly mulched beds. "I haven't seen you working out here in months." "The weather was too nice to waste indoors," I said, brushing soil from my hands. I forgot how much I enjoyed this. David helped me carry my tools to the garage, chatting about his day and asking about my gardening plans for the season. It was the kind of easy conversation we had always shared, and I felt a pang of sadness knowing that these moments would become memories sooner than he realized. "Jessica's going to love seeing this when she gets home," he said as we walked back, toward the house. "She's been saying we need to do something about the landscaping." I almost laughed at the irony. Jessica had complained about my gardening efforts as often as she had complained about their absence. But David's selective memory or willful blindness prevented him from recognizing the contradiction. Instead, I simply nodded and went inside to wash the dirt from under my fingernails. Evening arrived with the golden light that made everything seem softer and more forgiving. I prepared dinner with extra care, making David's favorite pot roast and taking the time to set the table properly, with cloth napkins and the good dishes. If these were among our last family dinners, I wanted them to be memorable for the right reasons. David noticed the extra effort immediately, commenting on how nice the table looked and how good everything smelled. He seemed more relaxed than usual, perhaps influenced by my improved mood or simply grateful for a peaceful evening at home after a busy day at work. Jessica arrived home just as we were sitting down to eat, her face flushed with irritation and her movements sharp with barely contained frustration. She dropped her purse and laptop bag by the door with more force than necessary, the sound sharp, enough to make David look up with concern. "Rough day?" he asked as she joined us at the table. "You could say that," Jessica replied, her voice tight with stress. "The client meeting was a disaster. They want to completely change the direction of the campaign after we've already done weeks of work. And of course, they expect us to absorb the cost of starting over." She served herself from the dishes I had prepared, her movements mechanical, and distracted. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her jaw clenched against words she wanted to say but was holding back. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," David said soothingly. "You always do." Jessica's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to explain to your boss why the biggest client of the quarter is threatening to walk away." The conversation continued in this vein throughout dinner, with David trying to offer supportive comments and Jessica deflecting them with increasingly sharp responses. I ate in silence, observing the dynamic between them and noting how Jessica's work stress seemed to intensify her general irritability. Toward the end of the meal, Jessica's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her face brightened slightly. "It's Melissa," she said to David. "I really need to talk to her about today. Do you mind if I take this?" David waved her away with understanding, and Jessica stepped into the kitchen to answer the call. I could hear her voice change immediately, becoming lighter and more animated, as she greeted her friend. The contrast between how she spoke to Melissa versus how she had been speaking to David was stark and telling. "You have no idea what kind of day I've had," Jessica said, and I could hear her pacing in the kitchen as she talked. Work was absolutely horrible, and then I come home to—" She lowered her voice then, but not quite enough. The house's thin walls and open floor plan made privacy difficult, and her words carried into the dining room where David and I were finishing our meal. "I just need to vent for a minute," Jessica continued, her voice carrying the frustrated tone of someone who had reached the end of her patience. "Living here has become such a nightmare, Melissa. I can't even have a peaceful evening after a terrible day because she's always just here, hovering around, wanting attention." David was clearing dishes and didn't seem to be paying attention to Jessica's conversation, but I heard every word with perfect clarity. My hands stilled on my water glass as I realized I was about to hear another installment of Jessica's true feelings about my presence in her life. "No, it's gotten worse," Jessica was saying, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a whisper, but was clearly audible from where I sat. The constant medical appointments, the pills everywhere, the way she moves so slowly and makes everything take twice as long. "I swear, Melissa, it's like living with a walking reminder of mortality." A walking reminder of mortality. The phrase hit me like a physical blow, more cruel than even medical burden had been. To Jessica, I wasn't even a person with needs and feelings. I was a symbol of aging and death that made her uncomfortable in her own home. "And David just doesn't get it," Jessica continued, her voice gaining intensity as she warmed to her subject. "He thinks I should be more patient, more understanding. He keeps saying she won't be around forever, as if that's supposed to make me feel guilty for wanting my own space." I glanced toward the kitchen doorway, where I could see Jessica's shadow, moving back and forth as she paced. David had gone upstairs to change out of his work clothes, leaving me alone with the devastating soundtrack of Jessica's true feelings. "The worst part is how she acts like she belongs here," Jessica said, and I could hear the bitterness in her voice clearly now. "Like this is her house too, just because she pays for the insurance. She rearranges things in the kitchen. She hogs the television in the evenings. She leaves her old lady smell in the bathroom after her long baths." Old lady smell. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it, except there was nothing funny about being reduced to such crude stereotypes by someone I had tried so hard to please. "I know I should be grateful for the money," Jessica went on, "but honestly, at this point, I'd rather be broke than have to deal with all of this. At least if we were struggling financially, it would just be David and me figuring it out together. Instead, I feel like I'm trapped in some kind of geriatric nightmare that I never signed up for." There was a pause as Melissa apparently responded, and I could hear Jessica's laugh, sharp and unkind. "Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. I'm only 31 years old. I should be enjoying my marriage, decorating my house the way I want it, having friends over without worrying about disturbing the elderly roommate. Instead, I feel like I'm running a nursing home." The conversation continued, but I had heard enough. More than enough. I sat at the dining room table, surrounded by the remnants of the meal I had lovingly prepared, and felt something crystallize inside me with the finality of a door closing. This wasn't just about Jessica's ingratitude or her casual cruelty. This was about fundamental disrespect for who I was as a person. In her narrative, I wasn't Carolyn Evans, a woman with 7 decades of life experience, wisdom earned through joy and sorrow, and contributions to make to the world. I was an inconvenience, a burden, a walking reminder of everything she feared about aging. Well, she was about to learn that this particular walking reminder of mortality had more life in her than Jessica had ever imagined. I rose from the table quietly and began clearing the remaining dishes, my movements calm and methodical despite the storm of emotions raging inside me. Jessica was still on the phone, still cataloging my many failings for her friend's entertainment, unaware that her audience had expanded beyond the person on the other end of the line. David returned from upstairs in casual clothes, looking relaxed and content after changing out of his work attire. He smiled when he saw me loading the dishwasher, the same appreciative expression he had worn since childhood when he watched me perform the domestic tasks that kept our family functioning smoothly. "You don't have to do that, Mom," he said, moving to help me with the larger serving dishes. "Jessica and I can handle cleanup." "I don't mind," I replied, and realized that this might be one of the last times I would say those words in this kitchen. Tomorrow, everything would change, and David would begin to understand the true cost of the peace he had been trying so desperately to maintain. Jessica's voice was still audible from the kitchen, though she had moved farther away, and I could no longer make out individual words. The tone remained the same, though, animated, complaining, seeking validation for grievances that painted me as the villain in her story. "She seems to be having a better conversation with Melissa than she had with us at dinner," David observed, loading glasses into the dishwasher with the careful precision of someone who had learned to do household tasks correctly through years of practice. "Work stress affects people differently," I said diplomatically, though privately I was marveling at how completely David missed the implications of his own observation. Jessica's mood had improved dramatically as soon as she had someone to complain, to about her terrible life circumstances, which apparently included living with his mother. We worked together in comfortable silence, the familiar rhythm of shared domestic responsibility that had characterized our relationship since David was old enough to help with chores. These were the moments I would miss most, I realized. Not the formal family dinners or the holiday celebrations, but these quiet intervals of working side by side, connected by the simple satisfaction of tasks completed together. Jessica's phone conversation finally ended, and she returned to the dining room with a visibly improved demeanor. Talking to Melissa had clearly provided the emotional release she needed, allowing her to vent her frustrations to someone who would offer sympathy rather than solutions. "Feeling better?" David asked, and I could hear the relief in his voice. He hated conflict and discord, preferring the smooth surface of apparent harmony, even when deeper currents told a different story. "Much," Jessica replied, her tone lighter than it had been all evening. "Melissa always knows exactly what to say." "I'm sure she does," I thought, imagining the conversation from Melissa's perspective. How validating it must be to have a friend who regularly calls to complain about her elderly mother-in-law, painting herself as the long-suffering victim of circumstances beyond her control. The three of us finished cleaning the kitchen together, a picture of domestic cooperation that would have been heartwarming if I hadn't just overheard Jessica's latest character assassination. She even thanked me for dinner, her voice carrying the performative gratitude of someone who had remembered to mind her manners. "The pot roast was delicious, Carolyn," she said as she wiped down the counters. "You really outdid yourself tonight." "I'm glad you enjoyed it," I replied, accepting the compliment with the grace I had been taught as a child, even though I knew it was as meaningless as everything else she said to me. The evening proceeded normally from there. David settled in his recliner with a book about sustainable engineering practices, something related to a project he was working on at the office. Jessica curled up on the couch with her laptop, catching up on emails and social media with the dedicated focus of someone for whom digital connection was as essential as breathing. I retreated to my room earlier than usual, claiming fatigue from my afternoon of gardening. Both David and Jessica accepted this explanation without question, probably relieved to have the common areas to themselves for the remainder of the evening. But I wasn't tired. I was energized in a way I hadn't felt in years, charged with the electricity that comes from finally seeing a situation clearly and knowing exactly what needs to be done about it. I sat at my small desk and pulled out a notebook, the same one where I had been keeping track of my research into senior living communities. Tonight, though, I wasn't researching. I was planning. Step by step, detail by detail, I mapped out exactly how the next few weeks would unfold. Tomorrow, the insurance payment would fail to process. David and Jessica would probably assume it was a banking error at first, the kind of technical glitch that happens occasionally with automatic transfers. They might not even notice for a few days, until David tried to fill a prescription or Jessica needed to schedule a doctor's appointment. When they discovered the truth, there would be questions. Panic, probably, especially when they realized the financial implications of losing coverage for David's pre-existing condition. They would call me, ask me to fix whatever had gone wrong, perhaps even demand that I reinstate the policy immediately. That's when they would learn that nothing had gone wrong. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. I wrote for over an hour, covering every scenario I could imagine, planning responses to every argument they might make. I wasn't interested in punishment or revenge exactly. I was interested in consequences. For 3 years, I had absorbed the consequences of trying to please people who were incapable of being pleased. Now it was time for them to experience the consequences of their own actions. By the time I finished writing, the house had grown quiet around me. David and Jessica had gone to bed, probably falling asleep easily with the satisfaction of people who believed their comfortable world would continue unchanged indefinitely. But change was coming, whether they were ready for it or not. And tomorrow the first small crack would appear in the foundation of assumptions they had built their lives upon. I closed the notebook and prepared for bed, but sleep eluded me for hours. Not from anxiety or regret, but from anticipation. I felt like a child on Christmas Eve, excited about surprises yet to be unwrapped. Somewhere in the house, Jessica was sleeping peacefully, unaware that her walking reminder of mortality had just set in motion a series of events that would remind her exactly how much life could change in a single day. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had complained about my presence making her feel mortal, but it was my absence that would truly teach her about the fragility of the comfortable assumptions we all make about our lives. Tomorrow would be the first day of Jessica's education in consequences, and I intended to be the most thorough teacher she had ever encountered. The 15th arrived with the same unseasonable warmth as the day before, but the air felt different, somehow, charged with possibility and change. I woke before dawn, not from restlessness, but from the profound satisfaction that comes with having taken decisive action after months of passive acceptance. I made my coffee in the good china cup, again, savoring both the taste and the small act of rebellion it represented. Today was the day my insurance payment would not process, the first domino in a carefully planned sequence that would reshape the dynamics of this household forever. David and Jessica followed their usual morning routines, unaware that this was the last day of their old normal. David read his newspaper over coffee, commenting occasionally on headlines that caught his interest. Jessica rushed through her preparations for work, her movements efficient and focused on the day ahead. Neither of them thought to check their bank accounts or insurance status. Why would they? For 3 years, my payments had processed like clockwork, a reliable financial contribution that had become as automatic and unnoticed as the sunrise. That reliability was about to become a memory. After they left for work, I spent the morning in the garden again, tending to the flower beds with the careful attention of someone who might not have many more opportunities to nurture growing things in this particular space. The physical labor felt meditative, connecting me to the earth and to my own sense of purpose in a way that had been missing from my life for too long. By afternoon, I had made significant progress on the landscaping that Jessica had claimed needed attention. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was improving property I would soon be leaving, but the work wasn't for her benefit. It was for mine, a final gift to myself and to the space that had sheltered me even when the people in it had not. I was cleaning my tools when my phone rang. The caller ID showed David's number, which was unusual. He rarely called during work hours unless something was wrong. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered, my voice carefully neutral despite the spike of anticipation in my chest. "Mom, I'm at the pharmacy trying to pick up my prescription, and they're saying our insurance has been canceled," David said, his voice carrying the confused frustration of someone confronting an unexpected problem. "There must be some kind of mistake. Can you call the insurance company and find out what happened?" And there it was, the first crack in their comfortable world, appearing exactly as I had predicted. "Let me check into that for you," I said, calmly. "I'll call them right away and see what the problem is." "Thanks, Mom. I don't understand how this could have happened. The payments have been automatic for years." "These things happen sometimes," I replied, offering him the kind of reassuring response he expected. "Don't worry about it. I'll get it sorted out." But I wouldn't be sorting it out, at least not in the way David expected. Instead, I would be explaining to him exactly why his insurance had been canceled and what it would take to restore it. That conversation, however, would wait until he was home and could give me his full attention. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet house and felt a profound sense of calm settle over me. The plan I had set in motion was working exactly as intended. Soon, David and Jessica would understand that their comfortable assumptions about my place in their lives had been built on a foundation far more fragile than they had realized. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I prepared a simple dinner, nothing elaborate this time. There would be no need for special efforts or extra touches. Tonight's meal would be functional rather than ceremonial, fuel for the difficult conversation that lay ahead. David arrived home before Jessica, his face creased with worry and frustration. He found me in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a basic pasta dish that would provide sustenance without requiring much attention once our discussion began. "Did you reach the insurance company?" he asked immediately, his usual greeting forgotten in his anxiety about the coverage problem. "I did," I said, turning to face him fully. "Why don't you sit down, David? We need to talk." Something in my tone must have alerted him that this conversation would be more serious than a simple explanation of bureaucratic errors. He settled at the kitchen table, his expression shifting from frustration to concern as he studied my face. "What's going on, Mom? Is there a problem with the account?" "There's no problem with the account," I said, taking the seat across from him. "I canceled the insurance policy deliberately. The coverage ended today." David stared at me for a long moment, clearly struggling to process what I had just told him. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful tone of someone trying to remain calm while dealing with what must surely be a misunderstanding. "I don't understand. Why would you cancel our insurance? We need that coverage, especially with my pre-existing condition." "I know exactly what you need," I replied quietly. "I've been paying for what you need for 3 years. $800 every month, taken directly from my pension and Social Security. Money I've been happy to contribute because I thought I was helping family who valued my presence here." The color was slowly draining from David's face as the implications of my words began to sink in. "Mom, of course we value you. Your family. This is your home too." "Is it?" I asked, keeping my voice level and calm. "Because your wife has a very different perspective on my place in this household." Before David could respond, we heard Jessica's car in the driveway. Perfect timing, I thought. Better to have this conversation with both of them present so there could be no confusion about what was said or why. Jessica entered through the back door, already talking about her day before she had fully crossed the threshold. "You would not believe the meeting I just came from? The client from hell struck again, and now they want—" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw David and me sitting at the kitchen table, our body language clearly indicating that a serious conversation was in progress. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice immediately shifting to the wary tone of someone sensing trouble. "Mom canceled our health insurance," David said, his voice hollow with shock. "I couldn't get my prescription filled today because we don't have coverage anymore." Jessica's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. "What do you mean you canceled it? You can't just cancel our insurance without talking to us first." "Actually, I can," I said calmly. "The policy is in my name, paid for with my money, and I have every right to make changes to coverage I'm funding entirely on my own. But why? Jessica demanded, her voice rising with each word. This makes no sense. We depend on that insurance. I know you do, I replied. Just like you depend on my $800 every month to make the payments you couldn't afford on your own. The question is, what have I been getting in return for that contribution? David was looking back and forth between Jessica and me, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. Mom, if there's been some kind of problem, we can talk about it. We can work things out. Can we? I asked, turning my attention back to him. Tell me, David, what do you think Jessica really thinks about having me live here? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see Jessica's face flush with what might have been embarrassment or anger. David looked genuinely confused, still trying to process the sudden shift from insurance problems to family dynamics. I think she's been very welcoming, David said slowly, clearly choosing his words carefully. I know it's been an adjustment for everyone, but we've made it work. Have we? I asked. Jessica, would you like to tell David how you really feel about my presence in your home? Or should I share some of the conversations I've overheard between you and your friend Melissa? Jessica's face went completely white, and I could see the exact moment she realized that her carefully constructed facade was about to crumble. The confident, self-righteous anger drained out of her expression, replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. I don't know what you think you heard, she began, but her voice lacked conviction. I heard enough, I said simply. Medical, burden, walking reminder of mortality, someone you can't wait to be gone. Should I continue, or would you prefer to explain to your husband why his mother has been subsidizing her own emotional abuse for the past 3 years? The silence that followed my words was deafening. David was staring at Jessica with an expression of dawning comprehension, while Jessica looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. The comfortable lies that had held this household together were finally being exposed to the harsh light of truth. Jessica, David said quietly, his voice carrying a note of pain I had never heard before. Is this true? And in that moment, I realized that the insurance cancellation had been just the beginning. The real reckoning was about to begin, and it would reshape all of our lives in ways none of us had fully anticipated. The truth, as they say, has a way of setting everyone free, even when freedom is the last thing they thought they wanted. The kitchen had become a battlefield where words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Jessica stood frozen by the door, her face cycling through shades of pale as she realized the carefully constructed walls of her deception were crumbling around her. David sat motionless at the table, his engineer's mind clearly working to process information that didn't fit with the reality he thought he knew. Jessica, David repeated, his voice carrying a weight that made my heart ache for him. Please tell me this isn't true. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times before any sound emerged, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. David, you have to understand. I never meant for you to hear those things. I was just venting to Melissa, because work has been so stressful and— You called my mother a medical burden, David said, each word falling like a stone into still water. You said you couldn't wait until she was gone. The devastation in my son's voice was almost more than I could bear. This wasn't how I had wanted him to learn about his wife's true nature, but there had been no gentle way to reveal such harsh truths. Sometimes reality arrived like a slap, sudden and shocking and impossible to ignore. I was frustrated, Jessica said, her voice gaining strength as she shifted into defensive mode. You don't understand what it's like, David. You're at work all day. You don't see how much extra work having her here creates. The scheduling around her appointments, the way she monopolizes the television, how she reorganizes my kitchen. Your kitchen? I interjected quietly, and Jessica's eyes snapped to mine with something that might have been hatred. Our kitchen, she corrected quickly. But the damage was already done. In her anger and fear, she had revealed more truth than she intended. David rose from his chair slowly, like a man who had aged a decade in the space of a few minutes. He began to pace, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was trying to solve a problem that seemed impossible. "All this time," he said, speaking more to himself than to either of us. "All this time, I thought we were making it work. I thought you were adjusting to having Mom here. I thought." He stopped pacing and turned to face Jessica directly. "What else, Jessica? What other things have you said about my mother that I don't know about?" Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they struck me as tears of frustration and fear, rather than genuine remorse. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she sobbed. "I just needed someone to talk to about how hard this has been." "Hard for you?" David's voice was rising now, his usually gentle demeanor giving way to an anger I rarely saw from him. "My mother has been paying $800 a month for our insurance." $800, Jessica. Do you have any idea what that means to someone on a fixed income? "Of course I know," Jessica snapped, her own anger flaring in response to his. "But that doesn't mean I have to pretend to enjoy having a roommate I never wanted." The honesty of that statement hung in the air like a confession. Finally, Jessica had spoken a truth that couldn't be softened or explained away. She had never wanted me there, had never seen me as family, had never been anything but resentful of my presence in what she considered her territory. "A roommate you never wanted," David repeated slowly. "My mother isn't a roommate, Jessica. She's family. She's the woman who raised me, who sacrificed for me, who has been contributing more to this household than either of us just so we could have decent insurance coverage." I watched this exchange with a mixture of sadness and vindication. Finally, David was seeing the situation clearly, understanding the true dynamics that had been playing out under his roof. But I also knew that this revelation was tearing his world apart, forcing him to confront the reality that his wife was not the person he had believed her to be. "David," I said quietly, drawing both of their attention back to me, "there's something else you need to know." Jessica's eyes widened with what looked like panic. Perhaps she was wondering what other conversations I had overheard, what other cruel comments I could reveal. But I wasn't interested in cataloging every slight or insult. I had something more important to share. "I've been making plans," I continued, my voice steady and calm despite the chaos swirling around me. "I've been researching senior living communities, and I've found several that would be perfect for this next phase of my life." David's face crumpled with grief. "Mom, no. You don't have to leave. This is your home. We can work this out." "Can we?" I asked gently. "David, sweetheart, you can't force someone to want me here. You can't manufacture affection or respect where none exists." Jessica has made her feelings abundantly clear, and I'm not interested in staying somewhere I'm not welcome. "But Mom?" David began, and I could see him struggling with the impossible position he found himself in. "How do you choose between your wife and your mother? How do you reconcile love for one with loyalty to the other?" "Let me finish," I said, holding up a hand to stop his protests. "I'm not leaving in anger or hurt, though I won't pretend those feelings aren't there. I'm leaving because I've remembered something important about myself. I'm Carolyn Evans, and I deserve better than this." Jessica had stopped crying and was watching me with a mixture of suspicion and hope. I could practically see her calculating whether my departure would solve all her problems or create new ones. "I've scheduled interviews with 3 different communities next week," I continued. "Places where people my age are living full, active lives instead of apologizing for their existence. Places where I won't be seen as a burden or an inconvenience, but as someone with value and contributions to make." "What about the insurance?" Jessica asked, her practical concerns immediately surfacing despite the emotional turmoil of the moment. I turned to look at her directly, this woman who had made my life miserable while benefiting from my financial contributions. "What about it?" "You can't just leave us without coverage," she said, her voice carrying an edge of desperation. "David's pre-existing condition makes individual insurance impossible to afford." "I'm not responsible for your financial planning," I replied calmly. I was willing to help family who appreciated my presence and contributions. I'm not willing to subsidize my own mistreatment. David was staring at Jessica now with an expression I had never seen before, as if he were looking at a stranger wearing his wife's face. "You're worried about the insurance," he said quietly. "My mother just told us she's leaving because of how you've treated her, and you're worried about the insurance." Jessica seemed to realize the implication of her priorities, and she backtracked quickly. "That's not what I meant. Of course I'm upset about Carolyn leaving. We need to think practically about what happens next." But it was too late. Her immediate concern for the financial implications rather than the human cost of her behavior had revealed everything David needed to know about her true character. "I think you should go upstairs," David said to Jessica, his voice carefully controlled. "I need to talk to my mother privately." Jessica looked like she wanted to argue, but something in David's tone warned her that pushing further would be unwise. She left the kitchen without another word, her footsteps heavy on the stairs as she retreated to lick her wounds and probably plan her next approach. David and I sat in silence for several minutes after she left, the weight of revelation settling between us like dust after a demolition. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I had no idea she felt that way about you." I reached across the table and took his hand, the same hand I had held when he was a frightened child needing comfort. "I know you didn't, sweetheart. You see the good in people, sometimes even when they don't deserve it." "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "How long have I been blind to what was happening in my own house?" I considered how to answer that question honestly without causing him more pain than necessary. "The change was gradual," I said finally. "At first, I thought it was just adjustment stress. New living situations take time to settle into comfortable patterns. But over the months, it became clear that Jessica never intended to adjust. She was just waiting for me to leave voluntarily." David's jaw tightened with anger. "She should have talked to me. If she was having problems, she should have come to me instead of making you feel unwelcome." "Would you have listened?" I asked gently. "Really listened. I mean, instead of explaining her behavior away or asking me to be more understanding." The question hit its mark, and I could see David remembering the times I had tried to bring up concerns about Jessica's treatment of me, only to have him dismiss them as misunderstandings or stress-related reactions. "I failed you," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I brought you into my home and then failed to protect you from my own wife." "You didn't fail me," I said firmly. "You loved two people who couldn't find a way to coexist peacefully. That's not your fault, David. Some situations don't have solutions that make everyone happy." We talked for another hour, working through years of accumulated hurts and misunderstandings. David asked me to reconsider leaving, promising to have serious conversations with Jessica about her behavior and attitudes. But I could see in his eyes that he already knew those conversations would be futile. You can't negotiate someone into caring about you. You can't argue someone into basic human decency. "The senior living communities I've been researching aren't exile," I told him as our conversation wound down. "They're opportunities. Places where I can make new friends, try new activities, maybe even take some classes. I haven't felt excited about my future in years, David. These places make me feel like there are still adventures ahead, instead of just time to fill." "You could have adventures here too," he said, but his heart wasn't in the argument anymore. "Could I?" I asked, while walking on eggshells around someone who sees my very existence as an inconvenience, while feeling like I have to apologize for taking up space in what's supposed to be my home. David didn't have an answer for that, because we both knew there wasn't one. The damage Jessica had done to my sense of belonging in this house couldn't be undone with apologies or promises of better behavior. Trust, once broken so completely, couldn't be repaired with good intentions. The next few days passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. Jessica avoided me almost entirely, leaving early for work and staying late at the office. When she was home, she moved through the house like a ghost, speaking only when necessary and never making eye contact with me. David tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the strain was visible in every interaction. He attempted to carry on our usual conversations about books and current events, but there was a forced quality to his cheerfulness that fooled no one. I used the time to finalize my plans. I scheduled tours of the 3 senior communities that had most appealed to me in my research, and I began the process of organizing my belongings and deciding what would come with me to my new life. The phone interviews with admissions coordinators went better than I had expected. Each community offered something different, but all of them shared a philosophy of active, independent living that appealed to me enormously. After 3 years of trying to make myself invisible, the idea of joining a community where my presence would be welcomed rather than merely tolerated felt like a gift. Sunset Manor offered the most comprehensive cultural programs, with regular visits from symphony orchestras, theater groups, and lecture series featuring university professors. The admissions coordinator, a warm woman named Patricia, explained that many residents continued learning new skills well into their 80s and 90s. Heritage Hills focused on physical activities and outdoor recreation, with organized hiking groups, swimming programs, and even adventure travel opportunities for residents who wanted to explore beyond their immediate community. The idea of hiking, again, something I hadn't done since Robert's illness began, stirred feelings of anticipation I hadn't experienced in years. But it was Maple Grove that captured my imagination most completely. Their partnership with the local community college allowed residents to audit classes, participate in research projects, and even teach courses in their areas of expertise. The director, an energetic man named Dr. Richardson, explained that they had former teachers, engineers, nurses, and business executives who shared their knowledge with both fellow residents and younger students. "We believe that retirement should be a beginning, not an ending," Dr. Richardson said during our phone conversation. "Our residents aren't here to wait around for something to happen. They're here to make things happen." The concept resonated with me so deeply that I found myself crying after I hung up the phone. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. This was what I had been missing, what Jessica's contempt had slowly eroded from my sense of self. I wasn't ready to be put on a shelf somewhere, grateful for whatever scraps of tolerance came my way. I was ready to begin again. I scheduled in-person tours for the following week, using money that would normally have gone to the insurance payment. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica's cruelty was directly funding my escape from her sphere of influence. David noticed the change in my demeanor as I began to research and plan in earnest. Where I had been subdued and apologetic for months, I was now energized and purposeful. I caught him watching me sometimes with an expression that seemed to mix pride with sadness, as if he were seeing the mother he remembered from his childhood, but knowing that recognition came at the cost of losing me. On Thursday evening, Jessica finally broke her silence. David was working late at the office, leaving the 2 of us alone in the house for the first time since our confrontation. I was in the living room reading, something I had returned to doing without apology, when she appeared in the doorway. "Carolyn," she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable and conciliatory. "I think we should talk." I looked up from my book, a mystery novel I had borrowed from the library, and studied her face. She had clearly practiced this approach, probably rehearsing in front of a mirror to get the tone exactly right. "What would you like to talk about?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Jessica entered the room and perched on the edge of the sofa, her body language suggesting she was ready to flee at the first sign of conflict. "I want to apologize," she said. I said some terrible things about you to Melissa. Things I didn't. Really mean. I was just frustrated and needed to vent. I set my book aside and gave her my full attention. This conversation had been inevitable, and I was curious to see what approach she would take. You didn't mean them? I repeated. So when you called me a medical burden, that wasn't how you really felt? Jessica's composure flickered slightly, but she maintained her apologetic expression. I was having a bad day, and I let my frustration get the better of me. You know how it is when you're stressed. You say things you don't really mean. Actually, I don't know how that is, I said calmly. When I'm stressed, I might be short-tempered or impatient, but I don't typically say cruel things about people. I do care about you, Jessica insisted, and I had to admire her commitment to this performance. You're David's mother, which makes you family to me too. I studied her face as she spoke, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. What I saw instead was calculation, the careful presentation of words and expressions designed to achieve a specific outcome. Jessica, I said finally, what do you want from this conversation? The question seemed to catch her off guard, as if she hadn't expected me to be so direct. I want us to find a way to move forward, she said. I want you to know that I'm sorry for how I've made you feel, and I want to try to do better. And you want me to reinstate the insurance policy, I added. Jessica's mask slipped completely for just a moment, revealing the desperation underneath. We really do need that coverage, Carolyn. David's condition makes individual policies almost impossible to afford. There it was. The real reason for this carefully orchestrated apology. Not genuine remorse for her behavior, but panic about the financial consequences of my decision. I'm sure you do need the coverage, I agreed. The question is, what are you willing to do to earn it back? Jessica leaned forward eagerly, apparently believing she was close to achieving her goal. Whatever it takes. I'll be more patient, more understanding. I'll help with your appointments, include you in our social activities. Whatever you need to feel welcome here. I felt a profound sadness listening to her promises, knowing they were as empty as her apology. This wasn't a woman who had learned anything from our confrontation. This was someone trying to manipulate her way back to a comfortable situation without having to examine her own behavior or attitudes. Jessica, I said gently, do you remember what you said about me being a walking reminder of mortality? Her face flushed, and I could see her struggling to find a way to explain away that particular cruelty. That was... she began, then stopped, apparently realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. That was honest, I said. Probably more honest than anything else you've said to me in months. And that's what tells me that this apology isn't real. You're not sorry for how you feel about me. You're sorry I found out about it. Jessica's carefully constructed facade began to crumble again. That's not fair, she said, her voice rising with frustration. I'm trying to make things right here. No, I said firmly. You're trying to make things convenient for yourself. Again, there's a difference. I stood up from my chair, and Jessica instinctively leaned back, as if my movement was somehow threatening. I've made my decision, Jessica. I'm leaving. Not because I'm angry, though I am. Not because I want revenge, though I admit to some satisfaction in seeing consequences for your behavior. I'm leaving because I've remembered who I am and what I deserve. What about David? Jessica asked, playing what she probably thought was her strongest card. You're hurting him by leaving. He loves you, and you're abandoning him because of a few comments I made to a friend. The attempt to make me feel guilty was so transparent it was almost insulting. I'm not abandoning David, I said. I'm giving him the chance to build a marriage based on honesty instead of enabling his wife's cruelty toward his mother. I picked up my book and headed toward the stairs, but Jessica's voice stopped me at the doorway. What happens when you get sick? she called after me. What happens when you really do become a burden and David isn't there to take care of you? I turned back to look at her, this woman who had learned nothing from our conversation. Then I'll handle it the same way I've handled every other challenge in my 72 years of life, I said, with dignity, grace, and the help of people who actually care about me. I left her sitting alone in the living room and climbed the stairs to my room, where I spent the rest of the evening researching the communities I would be visiting the following week. Each brochure, each website, each testimonial from happy residents reinforced my certainty that I was making the right choice. Later that night, I heard David come home and immediately go into the living room where Jessica was waiting for him. Their voices were too low for me to make out words, but the tone was clearly intense and emotional. I didn't try to listen. Whatever they needed to work out between themselves was no longer my concern. I was moving toward a future where my worth wouldn't be measured by my usefulness to ungrateful people, where my presence would be welcomed rather than tolerated, where I could be Carolyn Evans instead of someone's unwanted burden. For the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep excited about tomorrow. Friday morning arrived with a crispness that suggested winter was finally loosening its grip on the world. I woke with the kind of clarity that comes after a storm has passed, when the air feels cleaner and possibilities seem endless. Today was the first day of my tours, the beginning of choosing my new life rather than simply enduring my current one. I dressed with particular care, selecting a navy blue suit that Robert had always said brought out my eyes. Today felt like a day for looking my best, for presenting myself as the confident, capable woman I was, rather than the diminished shadow I had allowed myself to become. David was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, standing at the bell counter with his coffee and staring out the window at nothing in particular. He looked like he hadn't slept well, and I wondered how much of the night he had spent trying to reconcile the woman he had married with the person she had revealed herself to be. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, pouring myself coffee in my good china cup. The small ritual had become a daily reminder of my worth, a gentle rebellion against the expectation that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of consideration came my way. "Morning, Mom," he replied, turning to face me. "You look nice today. Special occasion?" "I'm touring senior communities today," I said, watching his face carefully. "Maple Grove is first, then Heritage Hills this afternoon." David's expression crumpled slightly, as if hearing the concrete details of my departure plans made them more real than they had been in abstract. "I still wish you would reconsider," he said quietly. "Maybe we could try family counseling, work through some of these issues together." I felt a deep sympathy for my son, caught between loyalty to his mother and love for his wife. But some problems couldn't be solved with counseling and good intentions. Some revelations changed relationships so fundamentally that going back was impossible. "David," I said gently, "what would counseling accomplish? Would it make Jessica actually want me here? Would it change the fact that she sees my medical needs as burdens rather than normal aspects of aging? Would it undo the months of subtle cruelty that I've endured while paying for the privilege?" He had no answer for those questions because we both knew what the answers were. Jessica's feelings about me weren't misunderstandings to be cleared up or communication problems to be solved. They were fundamental incompatibilities that no amount of therapy could resolve. "She's trying," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She talked to me last night about making more of an effort." "I know she did," I replied. "She talked to me too. She's very concerned about the insurance situation." The bitterness in my tone wasn't lost on David. He set down his coffee cup and rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion that made him look older than his 35 years. "This is such a mess," he said. "I don't know how to fix it." "You can't fix it," I said simply. "Some things are broken beyond repair, and this is one of them. The kindest thing you can do now is let me go with your blessing, instead of making me feel guilty for choosing my own well-being." "Jessica," appeared in the kitchen doorway at that moment, dressed for work but moving hesitantly, as if she weren't sure of her welcome. She looked between David and me, clearly trying to gauge the mood and adjust her approach accordingly. "Good morning," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Not at all," I said pleasantly. "I was just telling David about my tours today. I'm very excited to see what these communities have to offer." Jessica's face tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her composed expression. "That's nice," she said, though the words sounded forced. "I hope you find something that meets your needs." The careful distance in her phrasing spoke volumes. Not something you'll love, or a place where you'll be happy, but something that met my needs, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of joy and fulfillment. "I'm sure I will," I replied with a smile that was absolutely genuine. "The programs these places offer are remarkable. Lifelong learning opportunities, travel groups, volunteer work with local schools. I haven't felt this excited about the future in years." I could see Jessica processing this information, probably realizing that my departure wasn't going to be the reluctant exile she had envisioned, but rather an enthusiastic embrace of new opportunities. The dynamic was shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated, and I could practically see her trying to recalculate her position. David finished his coffee and gathered his things for work, moving with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions while his mind was elsewhere. He kissed my forehead, a gesture that had been part of our morning routine since he was a small boy. "Good luck today, Mom," he said. "Call me if you need anything." "I will," I promised, though we both knew I wouldn't need anything. I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, despite Jessica's implications to the contrary. After David left, Jessica lingered in the kitchen, clearly wanting to say something but unsure how to approach it. I continued with my morning routine, reading the newspaper and finishing my coffee, content to let her make the first move if she had something on her mind. "Carolyn," she finally said, "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday." I looked up from the crossword puzzle I had been working on, the same type of puzzle I had been doing the night I overheard her true feelings about me. "Oh? I think maybe I didn't express myself very well," she continued, settling into the chair across from me with the careful movements of someone approaching a potentially dangerous animal. "I want you to know that I really am sorry about those things I said to Melissa." "You've mentioned that," I said mildly, returning my attention to the puzzle. 7 letters for false appearance, facade. Jessica watched me write in the answer, probably wondering if I was making some kind of point about her behavior. I wasn't, but the irony wasn't lost on me either. "I was wondering," she said, "if there might be some way to work things out so you don't have to leave. I know the communities you're looking at are expensive, and it seems wasteful to spend all that money when you already have a home here." There it was, the financial angle, presented as concern for my well-being rather than anxiety about losing my insurance contributions. Jessica was nothing if not persistent in her attempts to manipulate situations to her advantage. "The communities aren't that expensive," I said, not looking up from the puzzle. "Especially when I factor in the $800 I'll save each month by not paying for insurance for people who see me as a burden." Jessica flinched at the directness of my response. "I never said you were a burden," she protested. "You said I was a medical burden," I corrected. "To your friend Melissa, along with several other charming descriptions of my presence in your life." "I was venting," Jessica said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "Everyone needs someone to vent to when they're frustrated." I set down my pencil and looked at her directly. "Jessica, do you know what I told my friend Margaret when I was going through the worst period of caring for Robert during his illness? When he was weak and confused and needed help with things that embarrassed us both?" Jessica shook her head, clearly uncomfortable with where this conversation was heading. I told her how grateful I was to be able to care for someone I loved. I continued. I told her about the moments of connection we still had, the ways we found joy even in difficult circumstances. I told her how precious it felt to be needed by someone who had always been my strength. Jessica's face was growing paler as she began to understand the contrast I was drawing. I never once called him a burden, I said quietly. Because when you love someone, their needs aren't burdens. They're opportunities to show that love in action. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Jessica stared at her hands, clearly struggling to find some response that wouldn't further incriminate her. Robert was your husband, she finally said. That's different. Is it? I asked. You married David knowing I was his mother. You knew that might someday involve caring for an aging parent. Did you think love was optional in that arrangement? Jessica's composure was beginning to crack again, and I could see the real woman beneath the carefully constructed apologetic facade. I didn't sign up to be a caregiver, she said, her voice rising slightly. I married David, not his entire family history. And there's the truth, I said with something that might have been satisfaction. You married David, but you never intended to be part of a family. You wanted a husband, not the relationships and responsibilities that come with him. That's not fair, Jessica protested. I've tried to make this work. No, I said firmly. You've tried to make me disappear. There's a difference. I stood up from the table and gathered my purse and car keys. Jessica watched me with growing alarm, probably realizing that our conversation wasn't going the way she had planned. Where are you going? She asked. To look at my future, I replied. To see what life looks like when you're surrounded by people who value your presence, instead of tolerating it. I left Jessica sitting at the kitchen table and walked out to my car with a lightness in my step that had been missing for months. The morning air was crisp and full of promise, and I felt like I was finally moving towards something instead of just away from disappointment. The drive to Maple Grove took me through parts of the city I rarely visited anymore, neighborhoods where young families were pushing strollers and older couples were walking dogs. Life continuing in all its ordinary, extraordinary complexity. For too long, I had felt like an observer of other people's lives rather than an active participant in my own. Maple Grove exceeded even my optimistic expectations. The buildings were modern but warmly designed, with large windows that let in natural light and common areas that invited socializing without demanding it. Patricia, the admissions coordinator I had spoken with on the phone, met me in the lobby, with a genuine smile and an energy that immediately put me at ease. Mrs. Evans, she said, extending her hand with real warmth. It's so wonderful to meet you in person. I'm excited to show you what we have to offer here. The tour began in the main community center, a spacious building that housed the library, computer lab, art studios, and multi-purpose rooms used for everything from lectures to dance classes. The library was particularly impressive, with both physical books and digital resources, comfortable reading areas, and quiet study spaces. Many of our residents are involved in our partnership with the community college, Patricia explained as we walked through the library. We have former professors who lead discussion groups, retired professionals who mentor young students, and lifelong learners who are taking their first college courses in their 70s and 80s. The idea of returning to academic life, after so many years away from it, filled me with an excitement I hadn't felt in decades. I had always loved learning, had always been curious about subjects I never had time to explore while raising children and managing a household. What kinds of courses are available? I asked, running my fingers along the spines of books that looked well-used and well-loved. Anything the college offers? Patricia replied. Literature, history, art, science, even some professional development. Courses if you're interested in volunteer work that uses your previous skills. One of our residents, a former nurse, teaches basic health and wellness courses to younger students. Another, a retired engineer, mentors students in the robotics program. We continued the tour through the independent living apartments, each One bright and spacious with full kitchens and private balconies or patios. The residents we passed in the hallways were engaged in conversations, heading to activities, or simply moving through their days with the purposeful energy of people who had things to do and places to be. The average age here is 75. Patricia mentioned as we walked, but our range goes from 62 to 96. What they all have in common is a commitment to staying active and engaged with life. In the wellness center, I met Dr. Chen, a geriatrician who served as the community's medical coordinator. She explained their approach to aging as a continuation of life rather than a decline toward death, focusing on maintaining independence and quality of life rather than simply managing medical conditions. We find that when people have purpose and community, Dr. Chen said, their health outcomes improve dramatically. Depression and anxiety decrease, cognitive function stays sharper longer, and even physical ailments become more manageable. The philosophy resonated with everything I had been feeling about my current situation. For months, I had been slowly losing my sense of purpose and community, gradually accepting a diminished version of myself because it seemed easier than fighting for better treatment. The tour concluded in the dining room, where I was invited to join several residents for lunch. The conversation was lively and wide-ranging, covering everything from current events to upcoming community theater auditions to a heated but friendly debate about the best hiking trails in the nearby state park. "Are you thinking of joining us?" asked Eleanor, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 80s who had been a high school principal before retiring. "I'm seriously considering it," I replied honestly. "This place feels so alive." "That's exactly the word," agreed George, a former accountant who was apparently taking his first art classes at the age of 78. "I spent too many years just existing, going through the motions. Here, I feel like I'm actually living again." The sentiment was so perfectly aligned with my own feelings that I felt tears prick my eyes. These people understood something that Jessica never would. That aging didn't mean diminishing. That needing occasional help didn't make you a burden. That having medical needs was simply part of the human experience, rather than a personal failing. After lunch, Patricia walked me back to the main office to discuss practical details like move-in timelines and financial arrangements. The costs were reasonable, especially when I factored in my savings from canceling the insurance policy, and they offered several floor plans that would accommodate my furniture and belongings. "When would you like to move in?" Patricia asked, pulling out a calendar to check availability. "As soon as possible," I said, surprising myself with the immediacy of my decision. "I know I should probably think about it more, maybe visit other places, but this feels right." "Trust your instincts," Patricia advised with a smile. "We've found that people who feel an immediate connection to our community tend to be the happiest residents." We scheduled my move-in date for 3 weeks away, giving me time to handle the logistics of packing and organizing my affairs. As I signed the preliminary paperwork, I felt a sense of profound relief, as if I had been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. The drive to Heritage Hills felt different now that I had already found my new home. This tour was more about confirming my choice than making one, but I was curious to see what other options were available for people in my situation. Heritage Hills had a more outdoorsy feel, with hiking trails and gardens integrated throughout the property. The residents I met were tan and energetic, many of them just returning from afternoon walks or preparing for evening exercise classes. "We have a very active community here," explained Tom, my tour guide, a former physical education teacher who radiated health and vitality despite being well into his 70s. Hiking, swimming, tennis, even rock climbing for those who were interested. The physical focus of Heritage Hills was appealing, but it didn't call to me the way Maple Grove had. I needed intellectual stimulation as much as physical activity, and the academic partnerships at Maple Grove offered exactly the kind of mental engagement I craved. By the time I returned home in the late afternoon, I felt like a different person than the one who had left that morning. I had seen my future, and it was bright with possibilities I had forgotten existed. I was going to be fine. More than fine. I was going to thrive. David's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, which was unusual for a Friday afternoon. I found him in the living room, staring at his laptop screen with an expression of deep concentration. He looked up when I entered, and I could see the questions in his eyes. "How did it go?" he asked, closing the laptop and giving me his full attention. "It went beautifully," I said, settling into my favorite chair. "I found my new home." David's face fell, though he tried to hide his disappointment. "That quickly? Don't you want to look at more places? Take time to really consider your options?" "I looked at 2 places today," I said. "But the first one, Maple Grove, felt right immediately. They have partnership programs with the local college, David. I could take literature classes, maybe even teach some courses in my areas of expertise. Can you imagine? At my age, starting a new academic adventure?" Despite his sadness about my leaving, I could see David responding to my enthusiasm. He had always been proud of my intelligence and education, and the idea of me returning to learning clearly appealed to him. "That does sound amazing, Mom," he admitted. "When would you move?" 3 weeks, I said, watching his face carefully. "I know it seems fast, but I'm ready. I've been ready for months, I just didn't realize it." David nodded slowly, processing the timeline. 3 weeks, he repeated. "That's not much time to—" He trailed off, and I could see him struggling with the reality of my departure. Not just the abstract idea of it, but the concrete details of a house without my presence, mornings without our coffee conversations, the absence of the routines that had structured our shared life for 3 years. "To what?" I asked gently. "To figure out how to say goodbye," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I reached over and took his hand, this man who would always be my little boy regardless of how old he grew. "We don't have to say goodbye, sweetheart. I'm moving 20 minutes away, not to another planet. You can visit whenever you want, and I'll have you over for dinner once I'm settled." "It won't be the same," David said. "No," I agreed. "It won't be the same. It will be different. But different doesn't have to mean worse." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of the changes ahead. Finally, David spoke again. "What about Jessica?" he asked. "What about her?" I replied. "She's going to have to live with knowing that her behavior drove you away," David said. "That's going to be hard for her." I studied my son's face, noting the genuine concern for his wife despite everything that had been revealed about her character. His capacity for forgiveness and understanding was one of his best qualities, but it was also sometimes a weakness that allowed people to take advantage of his good nature. "David," I said carefully, "Jessica is going to have to live with the consequences of her choices. That's not punishment. It's just how life works. Actions have results, and she's about to discover what the results of her actions are." Before David could respond, we heard Jessica's key in the front door. She entered with the careful movements of someone unsure of her reception, glancing between David and me as if trying to read the emotional temperature of the room. "How were the tours?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Excellent," I replied with genuine warmth. "I found exactly what I was looking for." Jessica's expression flickered through several emotions too quickly to read, but I caught something that looked like relief mixed with what might have been regret. "That's wonderful," she said, though the words sounded forced. "I'm sure you'll be very happy." "I'm sure I will be too," I agreed. In fact, I'm more excited about the future than I've been in years." The 3 of us stood there for a moment in awkward silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between us like fog. Finally, Jessica excused herself to change out of her work clothes, leaving David and me alone again. "She's scared," David said quietly after Jessica had gone upstairs. "Of what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Of losing the insurance coverage. Of having to figure out how to afford my medical care on our income alone. Of the financial reality that's about to hit us." I felt a brief moment of sympathy for Jessica's situation, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the memory of all the cruel things she had said about me. Financial stress was difficult, but it wasn't an excuse for emotional cruelty. "You'll figure it out," I said firmly. "People manage these challenges every day. You're both intelligent, capable adults. You'll find a way." "But it would be so much easier if—" David began, then stopped himself. "If what? If I stayed and continued subsidizing my own mistreatment? If I accepted being called a medical burden as the price of providing financial help?" David had no answer for that, because there wasn't a good one. What he was really asking was for me to sacrifice my dignity and self-respect for his financial convenience, though he would never phrase it so bluntly. "I love you, David," I said, standing up and preparing to go to my room. "But I won't destroy myself to make other people's lives easier. I've spent 3 years learning that lesson, and I'm finally ready to put it into practice." I left him sitting in the living room, probably contemplating a future that looked very different from the one he had imagined that morning. Change was coming to this household, whether anyone was ready for it or not, and I was no longer interested in cushioning other people from the impact of their own choices. 3 weeks to freedom. 3 weeks to the beginning of the rest of my life. For the first time in months, I fell asleep excited about tomorrow. The final 2 weeks passed in a blur of packing boxes and making arrangements. I had been methodical in my preparations, sorting through decades of accumulated belongings and deciding what deserved a place in my new life. Each item I chose to keep was a deliberate affirmation of who I was becoming rather than who I had been. Jessica maintained a careful distance during this period, watching my preparations with the wary attention of someone observing a chess opponent's moves. She no longer attempted the false sweetness of her earlier manipulation efforts, having apparently realized that ship had sailed beyond her reach. Instead, she observed my activities with something approaching fascination, as if she couldn't quite believe I was actually following through on my plans. David helped me pack with the quiet efficiency he brought to all tasks, but I could see the emotional weight he carried. We worked side by side, wrapping my mother's china and boxing up books that had been my companions for decades. Our conversations during these sessions were careful and surface level, both of us avoiding the deeper currents of loss and change that made the air between us heavy. On the Wednesday before my scheduled move, David came home from work with an envelope in his hand and an expression I couldn't quite read. He found me in the kitchen, where I was packing the last of my cookware into carefully labeled boxes. "Mom," he said, setting the envelope on the counter with unusual formality, "I need to show you something." I wiped my hands on a dish towel and looked at the envelope, noting the insurance company logo in the return address. "What is it?" "It's the paperwork for individual coverage," David said, his voice carefully controlled. "Jessica and I applied for separate policies after you canceled ours." I picked up the envelope and glanced at the contents, noting the premium amounts and coverage details. The monthly cost was staggering, nearly triple what my family policy had been, and the coverage was significantly reduced due to David's pre-existing condition. "This is quite expensive," I observed, setting the papers back on the counter. "We can manage it," David said quickly, though his tone suggested the opposite. "It'll be tight, but we'll make it work." I studied my son's face, noting the stress, lines that hadn't been there a month ago, and the forced optimism that couldn't quite mask his anxiety about their financial future. "David, why are you showing me this?" He ran his hands through his hair, that familiar gesture of frustration from his childhood. "I want you to know that we're not asking you to stay because of money. I want you to know that Jessica and I are prepared to handle our own responsibilities." The statement was clearly rehearsed, probably discussed and debated between them before David worked up the courage to deliver it. I appreciated the gesture, even as I recognized it for what it was. A last-ditch attempt to preserve some dignity in a situation that had stripped them of most of their bargaining power. "I'm glad to hear that," I said sincerely. "It's important for couples to be financially independent." David looked surprised by my response, clearly having expected some other reaction. Perhaps he had hoped I would be impressed by their sacrifice and reconsider my decision. Perhaps he had wanted me to feel guilty about the financial hardship my departure would cause. "There's something else," David continued, his voice dropping to a more hesitant tone. "Jessica wanted me to ask you something." I waited, curious, about what final request Jessica felt comfortable making through David rather than approaching me directly. "She wanted to know if you would consider letting us know where you're going," David said. "In case of emergencies, you know. She feels bad about how things ended between you two, and she wants to be sure we can reach you if something happens." The request was reasonable on its surface, but I heard the subtext clearly. Jessica wanted to know where I would be living so she could maintain some level of connection or control, probably rationalizing it as concern for my well-being rather than acknowledging her own discomfort with uncertainty. "I'll be at Maple Grove," I said simply. "It's only 20 minutes away, David. You'll always be able to reach me." "But what about Jessica?" David asked. "She really does want to make amends, Mom. She knows she handled things badly." I looked at my son, this man I loved more than my own life, and felt a deep sadness for the position he had put himself in. He was still trying to build bridges between two people who had no interest in meeting in the middle, still hoping that good intentions could overcome fundamental incompatibilities. "David," I said gently, "Jessica doesn't want to make amends. She wants to feel better about herself." Those are two very different things. Before David could respond, Jessica appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked between us with the careful attention of someone trying to assess whether she had interrupted something important. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, though she made no move to leave. "Not at all," I said pleasantly. "David was just telling me about your new insurance arrangements." Jessica's eyes flicked to the papers on the counter, then back to my face. "It's expensive," she said, her voice carrying a note of challenge, as if daring me to comment on the financial impact of my decision. "I'm sure it is," I replied, "but I'm confident you'll manage it successfully." The absence of guilt or apology in my response seemed to catch Jessica off guard. She had probably expected me to be affected by the evidence of their financial sacrifice, to feel some responsibility for the hardship my departure would cause. "We will," she said firmly. "We don't need anyone else to take care of our responsibilities." The irony of that statement was rich, coming from someone who had been benefiting from my financial support for 3 years, while treating me like an unwelcome intruder. But I didn't point out the contradiction. There was no purpose in continuing to relitigate grievances that would be irrelevant in a matter of days. "I'm very glad to hear that," I said instead. "Independence is important for everyone." Jessica seemed frustrated by my refusal to engage with the conflict she was apparently trying to provoke. She had probably hoped for some dramatic final confrontation, some emotional scene that would cast her as either victim or victor. My calm acceptance of the situation left her with nowhere to direct her energy. Moving day arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that made everything seem possible. The professional movers I had hired worked with efficient precision, loading decades of my life into trucks with the practiced ease of people who had done this thousands of times before. I stood in the driveway, watching my furniture and boxes disappear into the moving van, and felt a profound sense of liberation. Each item that left the house took with it some piece of the unhappiness I had carried for too long. David helped coordinate the move, checking items off lists and ensuring that everything was accounted for. He moved with the focused intensity of someone using activity to avoid dealing with emotions, and I let him have that space, rather than forcing conversations neither of us was ready for. Jessica watched from the front porch, maintaining the careful distance she had cultivated over the past weeks. She had dressed for work, though it was Saturday, probably using professional obligations as an excuse to avoid the emotional weight of my departure. When the last box was loaded and the movers were ready to leave, David pulled me aside for a private moment. His eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I could see him struggling to find words for a goodbye neither of us had wanted. "I'm going to miss you so much, Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm going to miss you too, sweetheart," I replied, pulling him into a hug that felt like all the embraces from his childhood wrapped into one. "But this isn't goodbye. This is just the beginning of a new chapter." "Will you call me when you're settled?" he asked. "Of course," I promised. "And you're welcome to visit any time. I'll cook dinner for you whenever you want." David managed a watery smile. "What about Jessica? Would she be welcome too?" The question hung between us, loaded, with implications and hopes I couldn't fulfill. I looked over at Jessica, still standing on the porch like a sentinel guarding territory she had never truly wanted to share. "Jessica will always be welcome in my home if she can treat me with basic respect," I said carefully. "But I won't pretend. That relationship exists when it doesn't." David nodded, understanding the boundary I was setting without asking me to compromise it. I hugged him one more time, then walked toward my car without looking back. Some departures required clean breaks, and this was one of them. The drive to Maple Grove took me through familiar neighborhoods that suddenly looked different, as if I were seeing them through new eyes. Everything seemed brighter, more detailed, more alive. It was the vision of someone moving toward something rather than away from it. Patricia met me at the main entrance with the same warm smile I remembered from my tour. "Welcome home, Carolyn," she said, and the words settled around me like a benediction. My apartment was exactly as I had remembered it, spacious, bright, and full of possibilities. The movers arranged my furniture according to the floor plan I had prepared, and within hours, the space began to feel like mine. That evening, I unpacked my good china and made myself dinner using ingredients from the community's grocery service. I ate at my own table, in my own space, surrounded by my own choices, and felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. A week later, David called to check on me. I was in my apartment, preparing for my first audit class at the community college the next morning, when the phone rang. "How are you settling in, Mom?" he asked. "Wonderfully," I said, and meant it completely. I started a book club, signed up for 3 college courses, and volunteered to help with the community garden. I haven't felt this engaged with life in years. "That's great," David said, and I could hear genuine happiness for me beneath his lingering sadness. "I'm glad you're thriving. How are things with you and Jessica?" I asked. There was a pause before David answered. "We're managing. The insurance is expensive, but we're making it work. And Jessica? Well, she's been different since you left." "Different how?" "Quieter. More thoughtful. I think she's been doing some reflecting on everything that happened." I felt a moment of curiosity about Jessica's belated self-examination, but it passed quickly. Whatever conclusions she reached about her behavior were no longer my concern. "I hope that reflection serves her well," I said diplomatically. "Mom," David said, his voice taking on the tentative tone of someone approaching a delicate subject. "Jessica asked me to tell you something." I waited, wondering what message Jessica felt comfortable sending through David rather than delivering herself. "She said to tell you that she understands now why you left, and she doesn't blame you for it." The statement was probably the closest thing to an apology Jessica was capable of offering, filtered through David to avoid the discomfort of direct communication. It was inadequate and self-serving, but it was also irrelevant. "That's nice to hear," I said neutrally. Is there any chance, David continued hopefully, that you might consider giving her another opportunity someday? Not moving back, obviously, but maybe rebuilding some kind of relationship? I looked around my bright apartment, at the books. I was reading for my literature class, at the calendar filled with activities and social engagements that brought me joy. I thought about the friends I was making, the intellectual stimulation I was rediscovering, the simple pleasure of waking up each morning in a place where my presence was welcomed rather than tolerated. David, I said gently, I've learned something important about myself these past few months. I've learned that I deserve to be treated with kindness and respect, not as a favor, but as a basic human right. I've learned that my worth isn't determined by how useful I am to other people. I know that, Mom. I've always known that. Have you? I asked. Because when Jessica was treating me badly, you asked me to be more understanding. When she made cruel comments about my medical needs, you explained her stress. When she systematically destroyed my sense of belonging in what was supposed to be my home, you asked me to give her space. David was quiet for a long moment. I was trying to keep the peace, he said finally. I know you were, I replied. But peace that requires one person to accept mistreatment isn't actually peace. It's just postponed conflict. So there's no chance of reconciliation? I considered the question seriously, thinking about forgiveness and second chances and the possibility of genuine change. If Jessica ever becomes the kind of person who can offer a sincere apology without expecting anything in return, if she ever develops genuine empathy for how her actions affected me, if she ever takes full responsibility for her behavior without making excuses or blaming circumstances, then we could have a conversation. But you don't think that's likely to happen? I think people can change, I said carefully, but they have to want to change for the right reasons. Jessica was upset about being caught, not about what she had done. She was worried about consequences, not about the pain she had caused. That's not the foundation for genuine transformation. We talked for a few more minutes, but the conversation had run its course. After I hung up, I sat in my comfortable chair and felt something I hadn't experienced in years, complete contentment with my own choices. 3 months later, I received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed Jessica's number, which surprised me enough that I answered despite my reservations. Carolyn? Jessica's voice was hesitant, almost childlike. I hope it's okay that I'm calling. Hello, Jessica, I said neutrally, curious about what had prompted this direct communication after so much time. I wanted to talk to you, Jessica said. In person, if that would be okay. There are things I need to say. What kinds of things? An apology, Jessica said simply. A real one this time. Not because I want something from you, but because I owe it to you. I was intrigued despite myself. What's brought this on? Therapy, Jessica admitted. David and I have been going to counseling, and I've been doing individual sessions too. I've learned some things about myself that I don't like very much. The admission was more honest than anything I had ever heard from Jessica. I found myself genuinely curious about what insights therapy had provided. I'm willing to listen, I said finally. But I want to be clear that I'm not interested in rebuilding a relationship based on obligation or guilt. If you want to apologize, it should be because you understand what you did wrong, not because you think it will somehow fix things between us. I understand, Jessica said. And I don't expect anything from you except the chance to say what I should have said months ago. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near Maple Grove the following Saturday. I arrived first, choosing a table near the window where I could watch Jessica approach and assess her demeanor before she saw me. She looked different than I remembered, somehow smaller and less certain of herself. She entered the coffee shop with the hesitant movements of someone unsure of their welcome, scanning the room until she spotted me. Thank you for agreeing to see me, Jessica said as she settled into the chair across from me. I wasn't sure you would. I wasn't sure I would either, I admitted. But curiosity won out over caution. Jessica managed a small smile at that. I've been thinking about what to say to you for weeks, she began. I've written it down, practiced it, revised it a dozen times. But now that I'm sitting here, all those carefully planned words seem inadequate. I waited, letting her find her way to whatever she needed to say. I was cruel to you, Jessica said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just unkind or thoughtless, but deliberately cruel. I said horrible things about you to other people. I made you feel unwelcome in what should have been your home. And I treated your medical needs like personal inconveniences instead of normal aspects of aging. The directness of her admission was startling. This was not the defensive, excuse-making Jessica I remembered. Why? I asked simply. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the answer. Because you reminded me of everything I was afraid of becoming, she said finally. Getting older, needing help, being dependent on other people. You represented mortality and vulnerability, and I couldn't handle that reminder in my daily life. The honesty was breathtaking in its raw self-awareness. This was the insight that months of therapy had apparently provided, and it explained so much about Jessica's behavior that had seemed inexplicably cruel. So you decided to make me feel as unwelcome as possible, hoping I would leave voluntarily, I said. Yes, Jessica admitted, and I told myself I was justified because you were getting something out of the arrangement too. Room and board, family connections, help with tasks you couldn't manage alone. I convinced myself that we were doing you a favor by letting you stay. Even though I was paying $800 a month for the privilege, Jessica flinched at the reminder. Even then, I found ways to rationalize my behavior, because acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting that I was being horrible to someone who didn't deserve it. I studied Jessica's face as she spoke, looking for signs of manipulation or performance. What I saw instead was genuine remorse and the kind of uncomfortable self-knowledge that comes from honest therapeutic work. The insurance money was never charity, Jessica continued. You were subsidizing our lives while I treated you like a burden. The financial contribution you made was substantial, and instead of being grateful, I resented you for existing. What changed? I asked. What made you finally see the situation clearly? David, Jessica said simply. After you left, he was so devastated that I started to understand what you actually meant to him. Not just as someone who helped with expenses, but as his mother, someone he loved and respected and wanted in his life. She paused, collecting her thoughts before continuing. And watching him try to rebuild his relationship with you while managing his disappointment in me made me realize what I had destroyed. Not just your comfort and well-being, but his relationship with you too. David will be fine, I said. We talk regularly, and I see him often. Our relationship isn't damaged. But it's different now, Jessica said perceptively. There's a sadness in him that wasn't there before. He knows that his wife drove away someone he loves, and he has to live with that knowledge. The observation was accurate and showed a level of insight into David's emotional state that I hadn't expected from Jessica. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jessica continued. I know I don't deserve it, and I'm not sure it would mean anything coming from me anyway. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I did, that I take full responsibility for it, and that I'm truly sorry for the pain I caused you. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing this unexpected conversation. The Jessica sitting across from me bore little resemblance to the woman who had made my life miserable for so many months. This version seemed to have developed genuine empathy and self-awareness, qualities that had been entirely absent before. Thank you for saying that, I said finally. It means more than you probably realize to hear you take responsibility without making excuses. There are no excuses, Jessica said firmly. My fears and insecurities don't justify cruelty towards someone who never did anything to deserve it. No, they don't, I agreed. But understanding the source of behavior is still valuable even when it doesn't excuse it. We talked for another hour, with Jessica sharing insights from her therapy and me asking questions about her process of self-discovery. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, perhaps the only honest conversation we had ever had. When we finally prepared to leave, Jessica made one last statement that surprised me. I want you to know that David talks about your new life all the time, she said. The classes you're taking, the friends you're making, the volunteer work you're doing. He's so proud of how you've thrived since leaving our house. It's been wonderful, I said sincerely. I feel like myself again for the first time in years. I'm glad, Jessica said, and her voice carried a note of genuine emotion. You deserve to be happy and valued. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand that. As I drove back to Maple Grove after our meeting, I reflected on the unexpected turn the conversation had taken. Jessica's apology felt genuine in a way her earlier attempts had not, grounded in real understanding rather than strategic manipulation. But I also knew that understanding and apology, while valuable, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. Some experiences change us in ways that can't be reversed, even by the most sincere remorse. I had learned to value myself in new ways, to insist on respect as a basic requirement rather than a special favor. I had discovered that I could thrive independently, that my worth wasn't tied to my usefulness to others, that aging could be a time of growth and discovery rather than decline and diminishment. Those lessons had come at a price, but they were mine now, part of who I had become. I wouldn't trade them, even for the fantasy of a harmonious family that had never really existed. That evening, I called David to tell him about my meeting with Jessica. He listened with the careful attention of someone hearing about developments that affected him deeply, but were ultimately outside his control. How do you feel about what she said? He asked when I finished recounting the conversation. I feel like she's finally become the person she should have been all along, I said. But I also feel like it's too late for that to change anything fundamental between us. Do you think you could ever trust her again? I considered the question seriously. Trust her not to be deliberately cruel? Possibly, if her changes prove to be lasting. Trust her enough to make myself vulnerable to her again? That's much less likely. I understand, David said quietly. I think I'm still processing everything that happened too. How are things between you and Jessica now? I asked. Better in some ways, harder in others, David replied honestly. She's more self-aware, now more willing to examine her own behavior, but knowing that someone you love is capable of such cruelty changes how you see them. Are you going to stay married? I think so, David said, though his voice carried uncertainty. We're working on things, but it's going to take time to rebuild trust on both sides. I felt sympathy for David, caught between love for a wife who had revealed troubling aspects of her character and loyalty to a mother who had been wronged. It was an impossible position, and there were no easy answers. 6 months later, I received a graduation invitation that made me smile with genuine pleasure. I was finishing my second semester at the community college, having discovered a passion for Victorian literature that had led me to consider pursuing a master's degree. The invitation was to David's promotion ceremony at his engineering firm. He had been made a senior partner, a recognition of the excellent work he had been doing, despite the personal turmoil in his life. I attended the ceremony with pride, sitting in the audience as David was honored for his professional achievements. Jessica was there too, looking elegant and composed, but we maintained polite distance rather than attempting meaningful interaction. After the ceremony, David introduced me to his colleagues as his mother, and I could hear the genuine affection and respect in his voice. Several people mentioned that David talked about me often, sharing updates about my college courses and community activities. "Your son is very proud of you," one of his colleagues told me. "He lights up whenever he talks about your academic adventures." The comment filled me with warmth, knowing that my choices to pursue growth and learning were bringing David joy rather than worry. As the evening wound down, Jessica approached me with the careful movements of someone unsure of their reception. "Congratulations on your studies," she said quietly. "David tells me you're considering graduate school." "I am," I replied. "At my age, it seems wonderfully audacious." Jessica smiled, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the woman she might have been if fear hadn't made her cruel. "I think audacious suits you," she said. It was a small moment, but it carried weight because it was genuine. Whatever work Jessica was doing on herself was showing results, even if those results came too late to repair what had been broken between us. A year later, I received my acceptance letter to the master's program in literature at the local university. At 74, I would be returning to graduate school, pursuing knowledge for the pure joy of learning rather than career advancement. I called David immediately to share the news, and his excitement was infectious. "Mom, that's incredible," he said. "I'm so proud of you for taking this leap." "I'm proud of myself too," I admitted. A year ago, I never would have imagined I had this kind of adventure left in me. "You've always had it," David said. "You just needed the right environment to let it flourish." Later that week, I received an unexpected card in the mail. Inside, written in Jessica's careful handwriting, was a simple message. "Congratulations on your acceptance to graduate school. Your courage to start over inspires me every day." I read the card several times, touched by the acknowledgement despite the complicated history between us. Growth and change were possible at any age, for any person willing to do the difficult work of honest self-examination. I kept the card, not as a step toward reconciliation, but as a reminder that people could transform themselves when they found the motivation to face uncomfortable truths about their behavior. My life at Maple Grove had become rich and full in ways I hadn't expected. I had made deep friendships with people who shared my interests and values. I was contributing to the community through volunteer work that utilized my skills and experience. I was learning and growing intellectually in ways that energized me every day. Most importantly, I had reclaimed my sense of self-worth. I was no longer grateful for scraps of tolerance or consideration. I expected to be treated with respect and kindness, and I surrounded myself with people who met those expectations naturally. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space had become someone who claimed her place in the world with confidence and joy. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been complete. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, but the best vindication is discovering that you didn't need revenge at all. You just needed to remember who you were beneath all, the ways other people had tried to diminish you. I was Carolyn Evans, and I was exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.